I had always bought and sold stuff my entire life, and then my dad opened up a small coin shop when I was 16. I worked with him, and then together we opened up a secondhand shop, and then we opened up a pawn shop. So it's all I've ever done. I enjoy doing it.
Someone please help me. I'm begging you. This was the desperate plea of Rick Harrison, the familiar face from Pawn Stars, in a recently leaked audio recording from a Las Vegas prison that left the world heartbroken. Rick's agonized screams echoed as he was assaulted by fellow inmates, marking what felt like the final blow to a once glorious chapter of his life. The tragedy reached its peak when a group of prisoners, led by a gang leader known as Tooth, brutally attacked him inside the facility. How did things spiral so far out of control? A man once seen as a symbol of success is now enduring harsh isolation over charges of tax evasion and selling counterfeit goods. But is the truth only what's been officially accused, or is there something even darker lurking beneath the surface? Let's uncover the truth in today's video. 1. The man behind the Pawn Stars empire. Rick Harrison went through an extraordinary journey to rise to fame thanks to a truly one-of-a-kind antique store. However, that very pawn shop was also what dragged him into a downward spiral, ultimately leading Rick to spend time behind bars. To understand how it all unfolded, we need to go back in time. Rick was born into a financially struggling family and faced numerous challenges from an early age. Being diagnosed with epilepsy during his teenage years might have sealed the fate of many others. But instead of letting the condition hold him back, Rick turned it into motivation to prove he could overcome any obstacle. At the age of 13, he began working alongside his father at a small pawn shop in Las Vegas. By the time he graduated high school, Rick had already gained several years of hands-on experience at the family-owned shop. Still, he wasn't content with just standing behind the counter. Deep down, he carried a dream of expanding the business, turning the pawn shop into a destination that would attract people from all over the country. Rick wanted to make the gold and silver pawn shop a recognized name, not just in Las Vegas, but nationwide. And so, he began taking steps to bring that vision to life. Over time, Rick developed a deep understanding of antiques, collectibles, and historical artifacts. His knowledge in these areas gradually made him stand out and drew attention from many people. Rumors about his ability to appraise rare items spread far and wide, and before long, his shop started receiving more and more valuable pieces. Bit by bit, the gold and silver pawn shop built a solid reputation, not only in Las Vegas, but across the entire United States. However, with success came its price. As the store continued to grow, Rick had to put in longer hours, handle increasingly complex deals, interact with all kinds of customers, and personally oversee the day-to-day operations of the business. Although the business initially got off to a good start, Rick quickly picked up the essential knowledge and skills required in the trade. He didn't want to be known merely as the owner's son. He had a strong desire to turn the small shop into a household name. As he grew older, Rick constantly worked on improving his skills, learning how to negotiate deals, assess the value of valuable items, and build trust with customers. From those humble beginnings, his store gradually evolved into a brand recognized worldwide. However, the rise of the gold and silver pawn shop wasn't solely due to Rick's sharp eye for spotting valuable items. The real turning point came in 2009, when the History Channel decided to launch the show Pawn Stars. This reality TV program catapulted Rick and his family, including his father, his son Corey, and his close friend Chumley, into the spotlight. Rick Harrison quickly became the face of a television show that attracted millions of viewers across the globe. For Rick, the pressure that came with fame was subtle at first. He enjoyed the perks of being a reality TV star, luxurious vacations, high-profile events, and a growing business empire. But behind the scenes, the constant media attention began to weigh on him. As Pawn Stars gained more and more popularity, Rick's personal and professional life came under increasing scrutiny. People wanted to know more about him, not just the man on TV making deals over rare treasures. but also about his family, his finances, and his behind-the-scenes business dealings. Fame is always a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brought Rick financial success and a level of visibility that most people can only dream of. His pawn shop expanded, and his brand became a global entity. On the other hand, the spotlight brought an intensity of attention Rick wasn't fully prepared for. With fame came expectations, and with those expectations came the pressure to maintain a certain image. In his efforts to keep the business profitable, Rick ended up getting involved in illegal transactions, and no amount of fame could shield him from public judgment. The public's perception of Rick changed drastically after the scandal broke. The man who was once a beloved TV personality had now become the subject of serious criminal allegations. 2. Money laundering and counterfeit dealing network exposed. Behind the scenes of Pawn Stars, one of America's most beloved reality TV shows, a hidden storm had been quietly brewing for years. Rick Harrison, the familiar face of the show, had long been seen as a symbol of trust, intelligence, and a passion for history. But everything the audience once believed in is starting to fall apart, as he now faces a string of serious accusations, including tax evasion, money laundering, and dealing in artifacts with questionable origins. According to investigative documents from the FBI and the federal tax authorities, Rick Harrison is suspected of using the gold and silver pawn shop as a front for illegal financial operations. Shell companies were created, money was funneled through foreign bank accounts, and countless undeclared cash transactions took place, all of which formed a complex laundering network that experts say would be nearly impossible to pull off without a deep understanding of legal loopholes. However, if the financial allegations were already enough to raise eyebrows, what truly sparked public outrage came from another angle. The historical artifacts once proudly showcased on national television may have actually been stolen goods. The investigation began when several museums across the United States reported the disappearance of rare items: a Civil War-era handwritten manuscript, a 19th century military medal, and an antique rifle once owned by a well-known officer. Notably, many of these items had appeared in episodes of Pawn Stars, where Rick personally appraised and purchased them for what seemed like bargain prices. An internal FBI report revealed that at least 17 items with suspicious origins had been traced, most of them coming from private collections or museum archives. Many of the artifacts were confirmed to have been stolen in heists years ago, yet somehow resurfaced on television, where Rick, either knowingly or unknowingly, validated their legitimacy. An anonymous investigator commented, "We cannot rule out the possibility that Mr. Harrison was fully aware of the illegal origins of these items. There are signs that certain transactions were prearranged, involving unidentified intermediaries and lacking any proper documentation of legal ownership." In addition, a significant portion of the allegations stems from a 2-year-long forensic audit. The report alleges that Rick Harrison deliberately concealed millions of dollars in income from the TV show and related business activities. By making false deductions, failing to report revenue from off-the-book deals, and routing funds through foreign companies, he managed to avoid paying the majority of his federal taxes for nearly a decade. A former accountant at the gold and silver pawn shop testified, stating that Rick had instructed them to adjust the numbers and use gray area accounting methods to stay under the radar. The whistleblower said, "Rick isn't clueless. He knew exactly what he was doing and always stayed one step ahead of the tax authorities." Rick Harrison was once the image of a devoted father, a hard-working pawn shop owner, and an inspiring figure who brought history to life through old collectibles. But now, that image is slowly falling apart. Fans are beginning to ask, if Rick was able to so cleverly hide these illegal activities, how many other pawn shops might be operating under the same disguise? 3. The fall of a legend. As soon as enough evidence was gathered, the trial of Rick Harrison officially began in Las Vegas. Courtroom 3A at the Clark County Courthouse was packed to capacity. Every seat in the gallery was filled with members of the media, fans, and people who had once admired Rick Harrison, the man behind Pawn Stars, one of the most popular reality shows in the United States. Over the course of the 12-day trial, federal prosecutor Amanda Ruiz took the jury on a chilling journey through a meticulously constructed criminal network hidden beneath the facade of a TV show. Ruiz opened by playing clips from Pawn Stars itself, showing Rick enthusiastically showcasing valuable antique items. But immediately after, she presented a series of documents, financial tracking reports, and expert forensic testimony that revealed many of the items that were publicly bought and sold on the show had actually been reported stolen. Some were artifacts taken from museums in Pennsylvania, Texas, and even a military institution in London. One of the most striking points Ruiz emphasized was an original draft of the Declaration of Independence, which appeared in a 2017 episode that had been confirmed stolen from the New York Historical Archives in 1995. Beyond that, Ruiz also presented documents from the Internal Revenue Service stating that Rick had hidden over $8.2 million in revenue from both the show and the pawn shop by funneling the money through companies based in Belize and the Cayman Islands. Proceeds from the sale of stolen artifacts were funneled into shell corporations disguised as investment and consulting firms. Rick Harrison entered the courtroom wearing a light gray suit, his face tense and worn. Gone was the charismatic, humorous man familiar to TV audiences. On that day, Rick looked like a shadow of his former self. Throughout the trial, he remained mostly silent, occasionally leaning over to whisper to his attorney. When the prosecutor listed the 17 confirmed stolen artifacts that had passed through his hands, Rick closed his eyes, gripping the arm of his chair tightly. When a witness, a former accountant at Gold and Silver Pawn, testified that Rick was well aware of the illegal cash transactions and had even instructed how to manage the books, Rick showed no reaction. He simply stared straight ahead in silence. For nearly 2 weeks, during a trial that shocked the nation in Las Vegas, Rick Harrison's legal team, led by David Kessler, a well-known expert in financial crimes and media litigation, worked tirelessly to turn the situation around. They attempted to portray Rick as someone who was overly trusting and too busy to oversee every transaction, having been misled for an extended period by his subordinates, particularly a few managers and accountants. They brought in several former employees of Gold and Silver Pawn to testify, claiming that Rick never personally got involved in inventory checks and that he often relied on a team of experts to verify the origin of the items. Rick's large team of attorneys worked around the clock to defend him, but the mounting evidence against him became increasingly difficult to refute. The issue extended beyond the stolen antiquities. It involved a broader pattern of alleged financial misconduct linked to Rick. He was accused of using his pawn shop as a front to launder money, funneling illegal profits through a network of shell companies to obscure the true source of the funds. The tax evasion charges only added fuel to the fire. For someone who had spent years building the image of a successful entrepreneur in the public eye, this was viewed as a betrayal that many considered unforgivable. On top of that, the evidence gathered by the FBI, validated by archaeological experts, was overwhelming and indisputable. On sentencing day, the courtroom fell completely silent. The federal judge delivered a firm verdict. Mr. Rick Harrison exploited his fame and the public's trust to engage in long-term organized criminal activities. His use of a television show to legitimize stolen antiquities is an especially serious and deceitful act. The court handed down the maximum sentence and ordered the seizure of his personal assets, valued at over $25 million for the deathly recording from the dark prison. Although Rick's world seemed to be collapsing, the most shocking part of the story had yet to unfold. The accusations, the media frenzy, the legal battles, all of these were merely the beginning of a true drama that would soon unfold behind the bars of a maximum security prison, where Rick Harrison would face an entirely different battle for survival. Rick's early days in prison were nothing but a blur. He was taken to a high-security facility, completely cut off from the luxuries he had once enjoyed in his previous life. Rick, who had previously negotiated million-dollar contracts and was respected in the business world, now had to follow the rules of a completely different system, where his reputation meant nothing. It was a dangerous place, and although Rick had always been able to handle difficult situations, this was a threat of a whole new kind. Violence was a constant presence in the prison, and Rick quickly realized that being a former TV star and a successful businessman didn't offer him any protection. In fact, it even made him a target for some of the inmates, who saw him as an easy prey. His life now revolved around simple meals in the canteen, hours spent locked in his cell, and occasional brief moments outside in the yard with other inmates. The glorious days of negotiating rare antiques, meeting celebrities, and living a life that many could only dream of were gone. Now, Rick's reality was the cold, harsh walls of a prison, mirroring the darkness that had overtaken his life. Just when it seemed that the abyss Rick Harrison was falling into couldn't get any deeper, an unexpected event occurred, shaking up all predictions and steering the story into an unforeseen twist. A leaked recording from within the prison surfaced. It was not only evidence of a violent incident, but also a brutal snapshot, revealing the stripping away of power and dignity from a man who had once stood at the peak of fame. The recording, nearly 4 minutes long, began with the sound of metal clanging against the bars, a chilling noise like the beginning of an unspoken tragedy. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, and then a male voice whispered, "It's him, 3rd floor. Dinner time." A second later, everything descended into chaos. The sound of hurried footsteps, shouting, banging on walls, and then, for the first time, Rick's voice was heard, no longer calm, but filled with sheer panic. "Please, I don't know who you are," he cried out, as if desperately clinging to the last shred of mercy in a world with no law. The listener can easily recognize the groans mixed with short, labored breaths, along with the strangled sounds of someone being choked. Another inmate sneers, laughing mockingly, "No one here cares that you were once famous." Rick pleads in desperation, "I don't deserve this, I'm just a businessman," his voice breaking like a child driven to the edge. Then, suddenly, a loud noise erupts, possibly his head hitting the wall or the floor. This sound, coupled with the savage laughter, becomes etched in the listener's mind, representing the invisible fear closing in on him. The final moment in the recording is the sound of crawling across the floor, labored breathing, and a weak voice saying, I beg, someone," then silence. The silence isn't peaceful, but heavy, haunting, like a grave that buries Rick Harrison's fame and illustrious past. When the recording ends, the world no longer views him with curiosity about the case, but with astonishment and confusion, realizing how easily a television icon could be brought down behind bars. Sources inside the prison reported that Rick was placed in solitary confinement after the incident, where he lives in complete isolation. Each day is a mental struggle. He suffers from chronic insomnia, refuses to eat, and many nights he wakes in a panic, mumbling that he's still filming the show. The shocks from the assault, combined with the mental pressure of facing serious criminal charges, have caused Rick to lose himself. A prison doctor described him as severely depressed, disoriented, and showing signs of psychosis. The situation worsened when the fame, once Rick's greatest asset, turned into a burden. Inmates not only despised him for the charges he faced, but they also saw him as an easy target to assert their dominance. Some called him Mr. History Channel to mock him, while others tried to approach him, asking for deals as though he were still running the pawn shop. But there were no cameras, no editing, no scripts. It was just Rick, a lonely figure in a cold prison, fighting for survival day by day. The recording ended abruptly, leaving behind an eerie silence, but the damage it caused was undeniable. When the recording leaked outside, Rick's legal team immediately convened in an emergency meeting. They tried to discredit the tape, suggesting it might have been edited or staged to manipulate public opinion. However, the truth was undeniable. No one could ignore the cry of a man pushed to the very edge of fear. While the recording may not have clear legal standing, it was a media bombshell, eroding the last remnants of public support. What happened? How did everything escalate so quickly? And most importantly, what did the recording reveal about Rick's actual situation in prison? For Rick, the consequences of the leaked recording were immediate. His legal team rushed to respond, trying to discredit the tape and downplay its significance. But the undeniable truth was that the public now had an inside look at his life behind bars, and it wasn't the heroic story they once imagined. The man who had once been seen as a master negotiator, a businessman who could acquire anything at a reasonable price, was now viewed as a victim, trapped in a dangerous world where power was determined by a different set of rules. Rick Harrison's life in prison, already difficult due to his fall from grace, became even darker after the leaked recording exposed his vulnerability. The prison environment was extremely harsh, where survival was often determined by strength, alliances, and sometimes sheer brutality. As Rick spent more time behind bars, the hostility from his fellow inmates grew, some targeting him due to the charges he was facing, while others saw an opportunity to exploit his fame. And at the peak of this tension was the assault. 5. The prisoner gang assault. The attack Rick Harrison had to endure was the culmination of weeks, if not months, of simmering tension within the cold, unforgiving walls of Clark County Jail. Although Rick was well-versed in savvy negotiations, there was no bargaining with the brutal code of the prison world. It all started on a gloomy afternoon as he stepped into the yard, a rough concrete space surrounded by barbed wire fences and eyes that never strayed from their potential prey. The yard was where inmates asserted dominance, forged alliances, and nurtured grudges, all in silence. Rick tried to keep to himself, avoiding conversations, ignoring provocations, and often choosing a quiet corner to walk or stare off into the distance. But that day, peace was no longer an option. According to an anonymous inmate, the attack was led by someone nicknamed Tooth, a man previously tied to a white supremacist gang in Nevada. Tooth was no stranger to the prison. He was an unofficial yard boss, infamous for his cruelty and his ability to control others through fear. With a face that had appeared hundreds of times on television, Rick quickly became a prime target for Tooth. He saw Rick as a symbol of the outside world, where power, money, and fame ruled. But in this place, all of that meant nothing. As Rick left the workout area and headed toward a bench, a group of 4 men moved in quickly. Tooth was the first to block his path. "You think you're different from us?" he asked, his voice calm but clearly threatening. Before Rick could respond, another man slammed a punch into his ribs, dropping him to his knees in pain. The attack happened so fast that many nearby inmates only heard groans and the sickening sound of teeth cracking. Rick tried to get up, but the next kick to his chest sent him crashing to the ground. "Welcome to the real world, antique king," one of them sneered, his voice dry like steel on stone. The blows kept coming. Rick was yanked up and shoved hard against a wall. Tooth growled an order, "Kneel." Rick stumbled, refusing to comply. The next hit landed squarely on his jaw. A loud crack echoed. Something had clearly broken. He collapsed like a sack of bricks. Another man pulled off a shoelace and tied Rick's hands together, while the surrounding crowd roared like spectators at a blood sport. No one intervened. No one showed mercy. Amid the chaos, Rick could only groan. He no longer screamed, only muttered in anguish, "Please don't. I didn't do anything. I just want peace." It was no longer the voice of a shrewd businessman or a confident TV host. It was the broken sound of a man crushed in both body and spirit. It took nearly a full minute before the guards came rushing in. The alarm blared deafeningly as they stormed into the yard, shouting for everyone to get down on the ground. The attack had ended, but what came next was only the beginning. Rick was dragged away, his body battered, one eye swollen shut, his shoulder dislocated, and blood covering his mouth. The prison medical staff had to stitch up 8 cuts on his forehead, while his mental state was nearly shattered. For the next 2 days, he didn't speak a single word, just lay there in solitary, staring blankly at the ceiling. Solitary confinement isn't a long-term solution. It's only a temporary measure. But for Rick, it was the first time in a long while that he felt safe, alone in that tiny cell. It gave him a moment to process everything that had happened. He was still alive, barely, and seriously injured. But the emotional and psychological wounds would take far longer to heal. To this day, the real reason behind the attack remains unanswered. Some believe Rick may have unknowingly offended someone by refusing to share his food. Others think Tooth simply wanted to send a message to the newly imprisoned celebrities. But one thing was clear: in a place where power doesn't come from money or cameras, Rick Harrison had become a walking target. And that assault wasn't just about physical violence. It was the prison's way of re-establishing the rules. In here, Rick was nobody. The man who once controlled his own destiny was now in the hands of a system that cared little for who he used to be. Rick Harrison's survival instincts were pushed to limits he never imagined. But the real question was whether he could make it through what lay ahead, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. His empire was gone, his reputation tarnished, and his body marked with scars. Yet as the cold, dragging days in his cell wore on, Rick would come to understand that the hardest challenge wasn't surviving the beatings, it was surviving the heavy burden of his past. 6. The brand collapses, the family fractures. In the midst of the ongoing legal battle, Rick was dealt yet another devastating blow. Pawn Stars, once the crown jewel of the History Channel's primetime lineup, was suspended indefinitely. The production company behind the show halted all filming until Rick's legal issues were fully resolved. The show, once a symbol of triumph, was now tainted by scandal, and its future had never looked so uncertain. The suspension of Pawn Stars struck a severe blow to the public image Rick had spent years carefully crafting. With the show off the air, he also lost the platform that had helped launch and define his personal brand. The pawn shop remained open, but the bustling crowds of tourists who once visited hoping to meet the show's famous cast had vanished. Now, many were hesitant to even step through the door, and the unique appeal that had long been tied to Pawn Stars was quickly fading, taking with it the lavish lifestyle Rick had grown accustomed to. His world, once filled with fame, luxury, and prosperity, was now reduced to tabloid headlines centered around courtroom drama. Rick was beginning to understand that everything he had worked so hard to build could disappear in the blink of an eye. Corey, Rick's son, who had appeared alongside him on Pawn Stars, also found himself caught in the public spotlight. For years, he had stood by his father, learning the ropes of the pawn business and carving out a name for himself in the industry. But now, Corey was being swept into the relentless media frenzy. Though he wasn't directly implicated in any of the alleged wrongdoing, his close ties to Rick made him a target of scrutiny. The Harrison family, once admired for their unity, Rick, Corey, and the entire team building the pawn shop and TV empire together, was now under immense strain as the legal troubles mounted. What hurt Rick the most was watching the very relationships that had once been his emotional anchor begin to fall apart. For years, he had taken pride in his close bond with his loved ones, especially Corey. The two had run the family business side by side, and their joint presence on Pawn Stars had helped create the image of a tight-knit, hard-working family. Corey, once central to both Rick's life and career, was now bearing the consequences of his father's actions. The media relentlessly searched for any detail that might shed more light on the downfall of the Harrison family, and Corey became one of the most heavily scrutinized figures. Under mounting pressure from both the press and the public, Corey was forced to retreat from the spotlight. As the lawsuit dragged on and the likelihood of Rick facing prison time became increasingly real, Corey had to make a difficult decision. He could no longer publicly support the father who had brought shame upon the family's name, even though his love for him had never faded. The relationship between them grew increasingly tense with each passing day. Corey struggled with inner conflict, torn between his love for his father and facing the harsh reality of the crimes his father had committed. There was no easy way to reconcile the image of the father he had grown up with, the one who taught him about pawn shop business and shared his passion for antiques, with the image of a criminal that the current allegations had shaped Rick into in the eyes of the public. Rick's relationship with his ex-wife was no less strained. Although they had divorced years ago, the consequences of his crimes still affected their shared history and the way they raised their children together. His ex-wife, who once enjoyed the privileges of being married to a successful businessman, now had to deal with the fallout from her ex-husband's actions. Public scrutiny not only targeted Rick, but also extended to those who had once been close to him. For his ex-wife, the emotional burden of facing the scandal and the media attention was almost unbearable, akin to the sense of betrayal she felt when the first accusations were made. The hardest part of Rick's emotional journey was the loneliness he now faced in prison. Before being sentenced, Rick had been surrounded by friends, colleagues, and family. He was an influential man, a businessman with an empire, and a star of a popular television show. But all of that had vanished. The friends who once shared meals with him, congratulated him on his successes, and admired his business acumen were no longer part of his social circle, disappearing and leaving him isolated behind bars. In those moments of silence, Rick had time to reflect on the choices of his past, the decisions that had led him to this point. The path he had walked with confidence now seemed like a distant memory. The regret for what he had done weighed heavily on him, and it was something he couldn't escape, even in the solitude of his cell. One of the greatest challenges of Rick's emotional journey was accepting the reality of his situation. He had been accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life, his business, his career, and his public image. But now, he was at the mercy of the prison system. During the months behind bars, Rick began writing letters to Corey. Letters filled with deep regret about his actions and expressing his unwavering remorse for the pain he had caused his son. These letters were not filled with flowery words, but with sincere confessions, showing a vulnerability Rick had never revealed before. For the first time in his life, Rick was no longer a confident businessman or a reality TV star. He was simply a father doing everything he could to mend the wounds in his relationship with his son. These letters were not a quick fix, but part of a long process, a way for Rick to demonstrate his commitment to making things right, even if it meant taking small steps over time. 7. What future awaits Rick Harrison? However, Rick's future will not be easy. Even if he is granted a pardon or released early, there remains the big question of what he will do with his life once he is back outside. The reputation he once built through hard work and his personal charisma has now been severely tarnished in the eyes of the public. Those who once admired him now view him as a cautionary tale. The pawn shop that he worked so hard to build is now in chaos. Although Corey has tried to keep the family business going, the damage to the shop's reputation is immense. His family will need time to heal the wounds caused by his actions. While Corey still supports him, he carries the deep pain of his father's betrayal. The bond that once was strong between father and son has been fractured, and it will take many years for them to rebuild that relationship. Even when the prison gates open and Rick is physically free again, there's no guarantee that his son, Corey, will be ready to open his arms and welcome him back. The emotional scars run deep in both men, and they will need to work through their individual pain before they can begin to heal their family relationship. Beyond personal and family challenges, Rick faces a much larger question. Will the world he once dominated accept him again? The Pawn Stars brand, which brought him fame and fortune, is now just a shadow of its former self. The show was pulled from the air in the wake of the scandal and no longer holds the cultural significance it once had. Can Rick return to that world? Can he revive the pawn shop and somehow rebuild the empire that made him a household name around the world? The future of Pawn Stars remains uncertain, with rumors about the possibility of a revival, but without Rick's involvement, the show will lack the core drive that originally made it successful. The future awaiting Rick Harrison outside prison hinges on his ability to adapt to a world that has evolved during his absence. The entertainment industry has undergone transformations, with new stars emerging and fresh trends taking center stage. Is there still a place for Rick Harrison in this new world? Can he find a way to reinvent himself, explore new opportunities, and start afresh? These are challenging questions, and Rick doesn't have clear answers, but he knows he must try. Although Rick Harrison's future remains uncertain, there is a glimmer of hope that he can rebuild his life, atone for his mistakes, and discover a new purpose in a world he once dominated, but now seems to have turned its back on him. It's a long road ahead, but for Rick, the journey of redemption has begun. Rick Harrison's case has concluded, but his future is still unclear. He doesn't know what life will be like after his release, or whether he can ever fully regain the trust of his family, fans, and the public. However, what he knows for sure is that the path to redemption starts with himself. If Rick Harrison wants to reclaim his life, he will have to take it one step at a time, confront the consequences of his actions, and strive to build a future grounded in honesty and integrity. The road ahead is long, but Rick understands that redemption, like everything else in life, will require hard work, patience, and perseverance. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. If you find this story thought-provoking, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next analyses. What do you think about this? Does Rick Harrison deserve to be imprisoned? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear your perspective.